You know, we upper caste people think very highly of ourselves when we write about caste. Because we think just because we're speaking about caste, we are casteless. Because it questioned the caste system in this form, and I was entirely blind to a whole set of people who are the reason we sit on stage. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
TM, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And I'd like to start the conversation with, if I could take a minute just to talk about TM's new book. Sebastian and Sons is the first exploration of its type into the mrdangam, the makers of the mrdangam being the instrument at the heart of Carnatic music. And it is not just one book, it is 3 types of work in one book. It is first an act of cultural documentation like we have not seen, because the role of these makers, the lineage, the legacy of these makers has never been traced before. He spent, I think, 4 years finding out the history. There is a family history in there that was never documented before. Then it is an act of justice, to give justice to the makers who are never, ever put at the front of the music that is so revered. And finally, it is a highly political book about the idea of caste in music, which is not just the theme of this work, but many of TM's works. And I'd just like to start by asking you, what was the trigger to write this really, really challenging work, which required clearly an intense amount of research?
Yeah, so first of all,
I'm so sorry, we may be talking about music, but that's not the music we're talking about. Please put your phone on silent, whoever's that was.
So I think it's first, just to tell the audience who don't know what the mrdangam is, it's similar to the pakhavaj, meaning it has a central drum which is made of wood with hide on either side, and that's the fundamental construction of the instrument. Well, I come from a family of business people. I don't come from a lineage of musicians. My mother does sing, but not professionally, more an educator than a musician. But so I started performing when I was 12 years. I've been singing and traveling, and then questions appeared in my horizon, and I wrote this really fat, big book called The Southern Music. And at that point of time, thought I'd achieved something quite spectacular. Because such a book on the aesthetics and society and politics and the history, musicology of an art form has not been written in this country. And there's a huge chapter on caste, and you know, we upper caste people think very highly of ourselves when we write about caste. Because we think just because we're speaking about caste, we are casteless. And I guess that arrogance probably also kind of entered me, until I realized when I was looking at the same chapter again, probably 6 months after the book was published, that I had not thought of the instrument makers at all. And here's this huge chapter which was considered controversial because it questioned the caste system in this form. And I was entirely blind to a whole set of people who are the reason we sit on stage. And I think it was a slap on my face. I'm glad it was a hard one, because then I went back and I said, okay, should I plug in a paragraph? We all know when we want to plug in a paragraph, it's a face saver. It's basically to say, look, I'm all good. I've covered all bases. Luckily, I didn't do it, and then started the work of meeting mrdangam-makers. Why mrdangam specifically? You could ask, why not, say, the tanpura or any other instrument? I think, first, I was always fascinated by the instrument. Said 2 reasons other than that. One is the fact that it involves skin and hide, made it even more complicated. Thirdly, you must remember that unlike a tanpura, I buy a tanpura from Meerut or Tanjore, I don't need to go back to the maker for anything. It stays with me. I change the strings myself, and unless it's really cracked or broken, I don't have a relationship. In the case of a tabla or a pakhavaj or a mrdangam, there is a relationship through life between the maker and the player. The change of the skin, there has to be a black spot that's changed. So there is an intimate relationship. And it's a messed up relationship because of how society is designed and how we are. So it automatically drew me to these stories. And that's when the journey began.
So if we can get right into that particular rupture, because you've mentioned somewhere that the mridangam is often prayed to, right? And yet...
Everything in India is prayed to. I mean, come on. Yeah.
And once it is prayed to, but on both sides of it are layers of skin. This is cow skin, this is buffalo skin, this is goat skin.
The holy cow
right?
is the most important part.
So this is, now here's the irony. It's prayed to. There is skin that the Brahmin will not otherwise touch, made by the Dalit whom the Brahmin will not otherwise touch, but will pray to the final instrument produced by them. How do we reconcile this dichotomy with the ease that we seem to?
Well, I don't know if you can reconcile that dichotomy. At least you come face to face with it. That's itself a big achievement. See,
No, my question was, how have we?
I don't think we ever have. I mean, none of us in this room have. We will, of course, like to sound progressive and stuff like that. But the fact is, it is an interesting conundrum, isn't it? So you have this Brahmin community pretty much dominates the playing of the mridangam, at least for the last 60 years. And they beat the cow skin for the tone. They tell the maker, I want better tones, which means I choose better skin. And the whole fascinating thing is, and then it's the holy cow, and you pray to the cow. So, but the fact is, that is where caste plays such an important role. Our whole life, we are playing around with this notion of antiquity. You know, even, I mean, look at the politics of India. We talk about this ancient India where everything was perfect and we hugged and kissed everybody. What bullshit, right? So when you fall for that kind of story, and we've all fallen for that storytelling at our homes, sometime or the other, you know, subconsciously it's passed on. And when you fall for it, then you also build these notions of what is pure and what is not pure. Which also means that we as a society design mechanisms, ugly mechanisms, to make the impure pure. And the ugly mechanisms are put into play by human beings who we don't even treat as people, who are then the people who are bridging that impure and the pure. And you know, one of the makers said to me in the interview, he said, you know, I am that person in between. If I go away, the mridangam cannot happen. Not because it can't be made, but because it stays impure. So you need this individual, you use this individual in order to give yourself a sense of purity, because you don't want to see the blood, you don't want to see the gore, you don't want to believe that even skin is got from a cow, you just believe you go to a temple and it appears in your tray or some nonsense. And then, so even vocabulary is designed. Please remember, we're talking about the mridangam, we're talking about society. We design vocabularies that we are comfortable with. So at some point, you don't call it skin anymore. When do you stop calling it skin? When does skin become an element of the instrument? Who provides that transference for you to then say, I can touch it? It's at a very objective level fascinating, at a very personal level extremely disturbing. But I think the first step is to stop parading this notion of purity itself. Purity is a lie, never exists. Impurity in ourselves makes us human beings. Okay, that's what we are. So come to that reconciliation that it is this mess that we are in that makes us who we are, and start engaging with these notions, and then we won't be killing people for carrying beef.
When you document the relationship between the maker and the performer, many of them went on to describe themselves as father and son. And it's interesting because at the same time, all the barriers that you speak of stay entirely in place. Let the slaughter happen out of my sight, you cannot eat at the same table, you cannot. It's not just the musician, it's not just the performer who calls them father and son. Often the mrdangam-makers did too. How did they see this as some kind of parental relationship when they're the outcast in this relationship?
But isn't that true of any discriminative mechanism? Is that the most ugliest part of discriminative mechanisms is what it does to the emotional, the psychological state of the person being discriminated. Because the person being discriminated then also is forced to be part of this system. And then you build these tropes. Everybody is building these tropes. Therefore, the lines remain. And therefore, those limitations remain. And therefore, emotionally, you can somehow justify what is happening. How is it different from, say, sexual abuse? If I say sexual abuse, everybody understands it immediately. It's fascinating. I've had this conversation on caste with multiple people, and they'll fight me tooth and nail on it and say, oh, there is no subtlety to this. You know, in my house, everybody eats on the dining table. But then I say, okay, let's talk about feminism. And then people, especially upper caste women, understand it very fast. Okay? It's the same mechanism. How do you justify father and daughter relationships when there's abuse happening? How is the daughter justifying the abuse as saying that is part of the love my dad is giving me? How is this very different that the person being abused? So this father-son trope actually baffled me, honestly. First, I couldn't figure it. I said, both people are saying it's like father and son. But what does this father and son mean? So both are in a way emotionally and psychologically, I'm going to use this word with care, gaining from that trope. And say I am the mridangam player, okay? For me, I see myself as a progressive person, as a person who cares when I say, you're my son from today, okay? And therefore, I place my own emotional self at a slightly better place than the rest around me. And I think my relationship is different. The person on the other side, the maker, the moment the word son comes, feels that there is a kind of access that nobody else has. You know, many makers will tell me, no other person from their community has the access to the upper caste home like they did. Now, that itself becomes an enabling tool in their mind. So, it's such a complicated, situation.
There's also an interesting strand there of, if I use the example of, I think, Rajamonika in the book, and a kind of what I can only call cognitive enslavement, which is his idea of, you mention him and the community speaks of him as he stood up to the Brahmins.
Yeah.
And he separately, his wife, and he speak of absorbing Brahmin habits. He sleeps, he takes an afternoon nap like them, and he eats meals. He becomes vegetarian, he does not eat. Right, now, his idea of standing up to Brahminism is to adopt it.
So he is a very interesting character. Unfortunately, he passed away more than a decade ago. I wish I could interview him. He's a rebel of a sort in his time. You know, he's the kind of guy who said, you know, I need a siesta in the afternoon. You know, I need to sleep. I'll get up at 4, I'll get my job done. I need this for lunch. You have to cook this for lunch. Okay, there's this side of him. So many people, players called him like, you know, too arrogant, spoke too much and bossed around the players. At the same time, there's an interesting thing happening to Rajamonika. He is called by one mridangam player who is not Brahmin as a Brahmin. And the reason is, they say, call the Brahmin here. And the reason is because he's become a vegetarian. So then another wife of another maker says, he did everything Brahmins do. That's why he slept in the afternoon, had lunch at 10 a.m. It's so interesting and complicated. So he is at one level adopting a certain cultural practices that go with his workplace, which are the homes of people. At the same time, he's also standing out and rebelling and saying, I am my own person, you know. So very fascinating character. He is actually an outlier in all the people I spoke to. I couldn't speak to him, I wish I did, but he is definitely an outlier.
The idea, and just the terminology, because when you spoke of the vocabulary, of the maker being an artisan and the player being an artist, what is that gap between artisan and artist?
This is a perpetual philosophical question about art and craft. It's been debated constantly in the world of philosophy and academics. I'm not going to get into that. When is something art? When is something craft? So that same problem comes when we use the word artist and artisan. In fact, in the book, I debated about whether I should call them, what should I call the makers? And I used the word makers finally. But are they artists? Are they artisans? Now, how does one really put your finger on it? Does an artist have to produce an object of art? Then is a mridangam an object of art? You know, that's a very, very fine line to really go. And I'm not in a position to take a stand on it, but I think the word artisan is also important. I think what is important is, are we creating knowledge hierarchies? That's what is more important. If you're creating a knowledge hierarchy between the artisan and the artist, then there is a problem here. then there is something we need to address. Because making a mridangam is not just about getting wood and putting skin, tying together. It's the nuance of how it's braided, how it's tuned, how it needs to be perfected, and every end of it has to be like, I mean, it's exquisite.
Pushing the boundary of what the music can do is essentially first what the instrument can do.
I mean, every mridangam player who got on stage or gets on stage and gets an applause that brings the house down owes a huge percentage of that to what the instrument was that day. Any tabla artist will tell you, the moment they strike it, they know that day whether it's happening or not. And they're talking about the tone. It's another very important thing is, you know, I'm a mridangam player. I come to this artisan, I say, excuse me, I need a great mridangam. So guy makes it, look at him and say, how do I describe the mridangam I want? You know, there's no actual way. So there are these very, very obscure terms. There's not enough weight in it, okay? The tone's just not right. It doesn't feel right. You know, we use these terms, right? What does it mean? How does the maker know when does it feel right? It's fabulous. The maker gets to know. So maker tells me about how he builds his relationship. He says, I don't know first what you want. I will do what I know to do, and then I will listen to you. He will watch his hands, the way the technique of playing is, the strength of the playing. What kind of style is this person interested in? Now, through about the second or third mridangam, the maker has actually created reality out of something abstract. And all the player can say is, it's perfect. Even the player does not know how reality is created. Now, if I'm going to create knowledge hierarchy and say this is lesser than the applause I get on stage, oops, that needs to be very strongly challenged. And I hope this book does that.
And just another point about, which was really striking, about the knowledge systems embedded in this kind of artistry. You spoke of, for example, the layer of paste, the stone paste Sadam, I think, and how, will you tell us a little your discovery about how they can almost tell the stones on the beach?
So, Sadam in Tamil, for those who know Tamil, is basically just cooked rice. I mean, that's all it is. But if you say Sadam to a mridangam maker or mridangam player, it means something totally different. So, all of you have seen the black patch on a tabla, right? Or, yeah. So we have a similar black patch on a mridangam. On the side that the audience can see is a black patch. Now, many people think it's just made of iron ore. No, it's very interesting. So when I started interviewing, especially makers from Tanjore, they kept telling me, you know, this is a special stone. It's, you know, the way they told me the story, I thought something magical. This is this forest. You know, there are snakes and scorpions there, and there are these bounds, and you'll only get it there. And I said, you know, I have to go to this place. Of course, times have changed. There's no forest, there are no mountains, there are no hills, they're just fields. And there's a little stream. And three of us go there, a maker, his dad, and we go there, and they just start picking the stone. It looks like any other stone to me. Within 10 minutes, they picked this really heavy stone. And they said, this is the stone which we break. And who breaks? The women in the house, who usually are not mridangam makers because they are told this is very physical work. And the most physical work of breaking the stone is done by the women. Right? That's classic behavior. But the stone is carried through about 6 kilometers by that day, these two old couple. And the woman breaks it into powder. And then you cook rice, and you make it like a paste. It's like, you know, putting chutney in rice and eating it, pretty much the same. There's this consistency, they know the consistency and they do it. And then they apply it with the thumb. There's this technique of applying it. Concentric circles, small or large. It's fascinating to just watch a maker do it. Now, when I saw that stone, I didn't know. And you know, all of us cocky people need some academic to say that you're right. Right? So I needed some academic from Harvard, from the States. So I did testing on these stones. So I got stones from 6 different regions, sent them all to IIT Madras, and said, tell me what its composition is. And then I sent the results I got to some professor of earth sciences in the US. And they kept telling me the stone is heavy, it's high on iron content. Every maker told me this. No maker has tested it. And they were absolutely spot on. This is high on ferric or ferrous. And they have found this stone or similar stones in different regions, in Palakkad, in Andhra, in Tanjore. Now, we sometimes trivialize this. I think we trivialize it when we say experiential knowledge. There's something more. There is a kind of, we have to understand there are different systems of learning itself, right? And to me, it was very important to learn in these fashions. I mean, how do they know how much to apply? How do they know that's the stone to pick? And the stone gives the tone. You change that composition, the tone will change. The mridangam maker will know if you just strike on a mridangam, whether it's made in Palakkad, whether it's made in Andhra, whether it's made in Tanjore. If in Tanjore, he will tell you which side of the family made it. I mean, these are PhDs, seriously. And you know what kind of PhDs you offer in this country, right? So,
I wanted to come, taking off from that, to your relationship with Carnatic music as a whole. And it has often been said entirely simplistically that you're opening it up, except opening up seems like a one-way street, you to the world. And then there are words like reinterpretation or reimagining. How would you describe your engagement with the form? What is it that you are seeking to do?
Tough one. I would like to say that I probably stumbled upon this journey because by the time I was 21, I was this successful musician. I was the star, one of the stars. I knew and I still know how to perform a good trick, which is a concert, by the way. I know how to get the applause. I know how to do it. And I'm not saying this with arrogance, though I sound arrogant most of the times. I'm saying it because I don't think it's a big deal. If you can't do it after a point, you shouldn't be doing it, right? But the problem was there, that I knew how to do it. And then I was like, okay, is it just that? I can just do this for the next 40 years of my life. I can get an applause. I can be happy. I can make money. But we keep talking about art in this very mystical way, like, artists are always considered these conjurers of sorts. There's nothing conjuring about a performance. It was basically, after a point, you're just habituating yourself and the audience to an experience that both of us are happy with. And we must realize that the world of the classicals, irrespective of where we are, is a very homogeneous world. I know exactly who's in the audience. I don't need to know the names. I know who they are. Whether you sing Khyal, Drupad, or Carnatic, or Western classical music, it is a very beautiful, self-serving bubble. It's wonderful. But I pretty much said, okay, if this is all it is, there must be something more to art. And that's when I started. My worldview came from the view of art. So I started reading treatises, going into the history of music, all this. And it troubled me more than anything else, because all my conceptual notions of beauty, of aesthetics were all being challenged. Time, how does time change the way we experience something? I know Fab India is one of your sponsors, but India is upper caste India is Fab India today. Just think of it. We're all just models of Fab India. I'm glad you're a sponsor. They won't drop out, I promise. But you know what I mean? The colors, our notion of aesthetics, our notion of design in our world is very homogeneous. So, but if, for example, if I saw a fluorescent green home, what would I think? Let's ask ourselves that question. So when I make that judgment, how am I making that judgment? These were the multiple questions. So my engagement with my own art form got disturbed. I say this with great positivity. And when it was disturbed, I was challenging performative, I was challenging content, I was challenging, and it is ultimately a very selfish thing at one level, right? Because it's about you. I mean, you're not doing service to society. You're wondering, you're struggling with it yourself. And I think it's from that struggle that I felt there are many more windows to this, okay? So there was a period where I was saying, okay, is it possible then at one time I may start disliking this music? Well, it was distinctly possible that could happen. I'm happy it didn't. But it comes from that kind of a churning which is not ended, it continues, that my perspective towards politics, towards country, towards identity, towards beauty, towards sound developed. And I don't believe it's about opening the window or opening doors for the art form. I think it's about, let's talk about democracy here, because this is a democratic discourse. Because we keep talking about democracy in this country in very, very narrow terms, in terms of politics or in terms of access and education. We never speak of cultural democracy. And I think that's been one of our biggest problems in this country. And what do we mean by cultural democracy? Do we ever challenge the lack of democracy in the world of art, all arts? Do we ever challenge the notion that it builds very homogeneous kind of clusters? That we convince ourselves that the homogeneity there and actually complete exclusion there is because it's very difficult or it requires certain skills. So then what are we saying of rest of society? So I think that for me, this built into a conversation about cultural democracy and not just about Carnatic music. Yes, Carnatic music is the focal microcosm that has allowed me to move in this direction. But it cannot end with that. It also means that I need to engage with every other culture that I have no association with respect, with being able to de-baggage myself and enter different spaces and truly see how can we build conversations. We need cultural conversations. We need conversations in tune, in dance, in movement, in making.
So one of the, and I think again you said somewhere, which is that often, you quoted the ethnomusicologist, I think Harold Powers, that as folk goes up the ladder.
So the whole world, classical and folk, is a fraud.
And I think basically he said that as folk goes up the ladder, it becomes classical.
Yeah, I mean, just think of the word classical and we already have an image of what it is and we decide what it is. But as an artist, I can tell you, every one of the reasons you will give me for calling my art form classical are bogus. I will show you 10 other art forms that will tick all those boxes, but we will never call classical. So we must wonder why. I mean, jazz should be called classical by any stretch of any imagination. We will never call it, which is why now they're trying to create something called classical jazz. Now, classical jazz is a subversive word. I mean, it is not just an artistic word, it's a subversive word, because classical is seen as the white man's game. So these words need to be reanalyzed, re-looked at. Don't think the word Shastriya is any better by any case, any chance, saying the classical is a Western world and, Eurocentric conversation we're having today or some nonsense like that. All that's just bunkum. The fact is Shastriya is as problematic. I mean, who writes the Shastra? Is the Shastra written? We are a fascinating bunch of people. At one level, we'll say we are an oral tradition. We don't write things. But then when we want to prove something superior, we say, look at the Shastra. I mean.
Which brings me very neatly to your relationship with language. Because your sonic relationship with language and your relationship with words, you are far more careful with vocabulary than most people in the world of art. Were you always...
in what sense? I'm curious too.
Because, for example, you said every word that has a meaning, it has a history, it has a legacy of usage, it has a history of exclusion and inclusion, right? And yet we use words rather carelessly. Were you always interested in how loaded words are?
No. Don't think I was like this before. Yeah, I don't think...
Your wife says you were an avaricious young man.
Yeah, you should have her on talking about me. That'll be interesting. I mean, let's be very clear.
What word is she changing now? Is she saying you're no longer avaricious or no longer young?
The second part is reminded every day in my home by my daughter that I'm not young. The first part is, my wife is a musician, Sangeeta. She's also a musician, which is fabulous to have. And she's a person who always finds fault in anything I've said or written. I'm sure when this goes online, she'll watch and say, what did you say? This is so problematic. I'm so glad she does, and we'll fight over it, but that's going to happen. But that kept aside, I think as a young person, I was like any other individual. I was completely blind to my privileges, and I just wanted to get out there and succeed and make it big. I mean, that's the truth. So I don't know what kind of conversation I'll have with myself if I was going to go back. So I want to constantly remind myself of that and say it in public, maybe not for you, but for myself at some level. Because I can't forget that, I can't be seen as this revolutionary person who is just, always, no way. I'm still completely damaged goods. I'm still discriminatory. I still don't sometimes notice, especially my gender privilege, the toughest one for a man to notice. So I just want to put it out there that it's just a constant battle. I mean, as long as we are constantly battling with it and not brushing it under the carpet, we're good. I was a very avaricious man. I'm still an avaricious man. I'm not any less. I just remember that I'm avaricious.
You spoke of the gender question, and both in terms of Carnatic as well as in the wider arts, you've mentioned that the idea of the female voice as being essentially somebody who represents the male point of view just quite literally in a female voice. Are we beginning at all to see a true female voice in the arts?
Are there any women singers or instrumentalists here? Okay. Well, I still think, okay, I would like to say yes, but I'm not too sure. Because we're talking about something that's abstract and that somebody is kind of picking up from what you see or hear in music. I think the fact is that the world of the arts, especially if you're talking about the so-called classicals, it is controlled by machismo and men. Okay? The power centers are still men. And therefore, there is a great pressure of that masculinity that men believe is masculine on the arts. There have always been women who have found ways to subvert it, to get around it, to find their angle to it. That's true. But is it today a democratic space where you can just allow a discourse to go? I don't think so. It's not true of anything in society today, right? There's always a need to maneuver. You know, I think the day when a woman doesn't need to, a woman or a trans person, or or a homosexual or anybody gay or whatever, doesn't need to maneuver anything. Let's say it's at least a percentage drops.
Well, when they stop needing to be a movement.
Yeah, exactly. I think then we are actually discussing something that's going forward. Until then, it is still the same, I'll tell you, in Carnatic music, there are more women singers than men singers, male today. It's very interesting. But it's absolutely sexist environment, right? So because the power centers, the notion of sound, the notion of music, who is deciding all this? Who is deciding what is serious music? That's another thing, There is what you consider serious and what you consider enjoyable are two different things. You will buy a ticket to enjoy something. You may pay much more money. You may pay less money for something that is serious, but you will always want to flaunt the serious. Right? It's very interesting, and the man is always defining that serious. That needs to change.
Just coming to, and there are such large questions that we can only briefly touch on them, art, but music in particular, and protest, music and religion. The fault lines along which society currently seems to exist.
It does exist, not seems.
Yeah, so it absolutely does exist. Now for example, music and religion, how do you navigate? You've said at some point that, how would you describe yourself? Are you an atheist? Are you a heretic? Are you a believer? What are you a believer in?
I don't even find a necessity to actually describe myself as any of that.
Sure, but I meant that, so what is your relationship with music and religion, religious music in particular?
So I think that's an important question, in especially today's context, in culture, art, music, religion, faith. Yeah. I think that is something that the progressive world needs to seriously think about. Because, do I believe in God? What God? How do you define God? Don't believe? I don't know. I float around. Depends on the day, depends on whether I need God or not. If I need God, then I need God that day. Simple. If I go to a temple, sometimes I'm moved. I don't need to explain to myself why I'm moved. I don't need to explain to anybody. Some days I find it absolutely immaterial to my life, but that's beautiful. But the problem is I think we have to reflect and be self-critical. That we have created an environment, a conversation, a kind of a messaging in the progressive world that faith and belief in religion is somehow something lesser. That it somehow is something lower than the rational, constitution-believing citizen. This is deeply problematic. In fact, the right-wing bigots have been able to exactly pick on this and create today a chasm between what is democratic India and what is civilizational India. Civilizational India and democratic India, you don't need a chasm between the two. The reason is we have failed in creating a healthy discourse. How do I deal with, say, ritual? Forget about faith. Every one of us have rituals. Every community, every member has a ritual, and they believe in it. So how does one find a discourse of equality, of equity, of fraternity, of socialism, of secularism? These are just words, but how does one create a discourse in society of culture that doesn't always present itself as being superior to this way of living? Because this is our way of living. That is important today.
And yet you say that art must always be subversive.
Oh, yeah.
So how must it subvert this conversation?
Our job is much harder. Because the moment I say that you need to deal with faith and religion and everything, I know my left friends will come and tell me, but what about gender discrimination? What about casteism? Of course it's all there. But you can't deal with it if you're not willing to put yourself in that place of faith. Faith is a human need. Faith is hope. Without faith, we will not get up the next morning and hope that something better will happen. Whether Rama is my faith, Allah is my faith, Jesus is my faith, or Constitution is my faith, it's still a faith. I know you will say you can't compare the two. I am going to place all four together because it is something I trust. And whether you think it's bogus or not is immaterial to me. So how am I going to create a discourse in that so that you can still speak about all the ugliness that's around us, but also find respect? Every individual wants to be respected for what they believe in. This is a challenge for the progressives in India. What we are experiencing today should lead us to a point where we try and create an entirely new way of understanding ourselves.
I know the bell has rung. We absolutely cannot even move to audience questions till we ask you to sing. And I have one more question before that. But I just want to talk very briefly about on your YouTube channel, the new series you just began called The Artist. And I think there's only one episode. I would urge all of you to watch it. The first episode is TM playing interviewer to an artist of a form called Parai, right? Am I pronouncing it correct? And I'd love you to tell us a little bit about what you intend with that series and why you believe it is crucial. So
the series comes out of my experiences with many artists and many art forms, and especially art forms and artists that we don't talk about. So Parai is a very important art. It's an important art form which starts a very crucial discourse. So Parai literally means in Malayalam, para is to say. Okay? Parai was used to send messages. It's a kind of a tambourine, kind of a drum. And it was used to send messages. It also was played during death ceremonies, played during when a baby is born. But the association with funeral and the fact that it's played by the Dalit community has stigmatized that entire art form, and to the point that people will tell you if they go to a tea shop, it's not just the parai, they play a few other instruments. They are not even allowed to keep that instrument next to the tea shop because tea shop vendor will say, take it away from here, I don't want a death here. That's the level of stigma we're talking about. So the first conversation is with this incredible artist, Deepan, who is not only an artist, he also works with children at the railway station who are lost, rehabilitates them, finds a home for them, and he speaks about the rhythms in it, speaks about the culture of North Chennai, because North Chennai is again considered a place of, within quotes, no culture, drugs, rape, and alcoholism. You know, we do that to every city, right? And he talks about how culture is vibrant. So it's, I think for me, a way to have, to enlarge these conversations. People listen to him, listen to her, listen to these people and understand different cultures, different ways of expressing oneself, and different rituals. And again, I go back to finding ways to make conversations nuanced, conversations sincere, not necessarily getting an answer or being correct.
And the song, you recently sang the non-anthem part of Jana Gana Mana, the rest of the poem or parts of the rest of the poem that are not sung as part of the national anthem. It is remarkably moving, and I think most of us, or many of us in the audience, would never have heard it Would you sing us
Sure.
a bit of
I must
that?
first say that I stumbled upon it. Before that, I have a joke. I hope it's a joke. So, the great musician Balamurali Krishna was once at dinner, and he was constantly asked by the host and friends, "Sir, can you sing one song? Can you please sing one song?" He kind of listened to these people for half an hour. He said, "Next time you get a cardiac surgeon, ask him to do a surgery right here." So, on that note, I'm going to sing a song. So, honestly, I didn't know about this part of the anthem. I was giving a lecture in Bangalore when I spoke about the anthem, and a young girl came up to me and said, "Why is the Northeast not mentioned in the anthem?" And I didn't know about this section, so I said, "That's a very good question, something we should think about." And my very dear friend and very knowledgeable friend, Gopal Gandhi, 2 days later said, "Tagore didn't forget it." So then he passed me these verses in which there is a mention of the sun rising in the east. I think there were many reasons why these verses were not taken as part of the anthem. For the people who don't know Bangla, just to give you a gist of it, this is a very moving part of the song. It's very relevant to what's happened and happening in Delhi. It's very relevant to what's happening in our country for so many years now. It's very relevant that we never, never, never place the word "but" when somebody has been killed. We have to stop doing that. If somebody has been killed, that cannot happen. We can't say, "But, you know, there is something so, so, so low about the way we are doing that." And this song, I think, raises that. In this song, Tagore goes to say that we are in a very dark place. We are frightened. We are terrified. But he says there is light at the end of the tunnel. All of you wake up, and the sun will rise behind the eastern hills. I do hope that he was prophetic, not only then, as much today. Oh, raho tobo ahvano procharito shunitobo udaro bani. Oh, raho tobo ahvano procharito shunitobo udaro bani. Hindu, Bauddha, Shiko, Jaina, Paroshiko, Musulmano, Kristani. Hindu, Bauddha, Shiko, Jaina, Paroshiko, Musulmano, Kristani. পূরব পশ্চিম আসে তব সিংহাসন পাশে প্রেম হরণত গাথা ঘোর তিমির ঘন নিবিড় নিশীতে পীড়িত মূর্ছিত দেশে ঘোর তিমির ঘন নিবিড় নিশীতে পীড়িত মূর্ছিত দেশে জাগৃত ছিল তব বিচল মঙ্গল নত নয়নে অনিমেষে হে জাগৃত ছিল তব বিচল মঙ্গল নত নয়নে অনিমেষে দুঃস্বপ্নে আতঙ্কে রোখ করিলে অঙ্কে স্নেহময়ী তুম মাতা প্রভাতিলো উদিল রবি ছবি পূর্ব উদয়গিরি ভালে রাত্রি প্রভাতিলো উদিল রবি ছবি পূর্ব উদয়গিরি ভালে গাহে বিহঙ্গম পুণ্য সমীরণ নবজীবন রস ঢালে এ গাহে বিহঙ্গম পুণ্য সমীরণ নবজীবন রস ঢালে তব করুণারুণ রাগে নিদ্রিত ভারত জাগে তব করুণারুণ রাগে নিদ্রিত ভারত জাগে তব চরণে নত মাথা তব চরণে নত মাথা তব চরণে নত মাথা
We'll take a few questions. I think it's frankly an injustice to talk anymore after that, but we will take audience questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll try and get a mic to you. Wow, I've literally never seen this. We've been silenced. There's a question that we'll just get. Can somebody get Vipul? May I just request that you make your question a question?
I want to know how you reconcile the idea of, as a young performer myself, or being interested in classical forms, being interested in forms that have traditionally been horrifically, not just patriarchal, but also casteist, like say something like Kudiyattam in Kerala or something like that. How do you think about our relationship to that form today as an audience, or somebody who still might want to be interested in the form? Is there a statement to be made in a rejection of it? Is there something important in that? Is there a via media between the two, or just how to think about something like that?
Well, I think rejection for me is a no-no. Complicating it is a yes. I think there's two parts. One is if you're part of the form, you complicate it from within, which is what I try to do in the form that I perform, is I complicate my own relationship with it. You know, my own, it's very simple things sometimes. A word which you may know have no meaning, you may know no meaning of it, has resonances in you. Another word which has a cultural location which you recognize has a different resonance in you. So can you complicate that relationship? Can I complicate my own patriarchy in my form? Is as a performer. Now, but even as an interacting person, as a person of the audience, I think it is important that we do complicate our relationship. We do make it messy. We do challenge it. But rejection is not going to get us anywhere, because you need, at the same time, discarding the past is also not going to get anywhere. I like the fact I like to play with the possibility of both coexisting and complicating your experience. So if you came to a concert of mine, I would try my best to complicate your experience of it. So you don't know whether it's divine, whether it's not divine, whether it's profane, whether it made you queasy at one point, whether it made you levitate another point. That's interesting. I think that's what we need to do. Because you can't either wish away the grotesqueness of societal facts, but you can't also wish away the form itself. So the form itself needs to be messed. The audience needs to participate in this discourse. The people need to participate in the mess. I mean, it's like a classic question. Would you watch a Roman Polanski film? Do you have a right answer to that question? We don't have a right answer. But can you mess up your experience of the film? Yep. You can. I know it sounds a little abstract, but it is abstract. I don't have a solution to it. But I think we can complicate our relationship. We need to play with the past. We need to pick the past. We need to also create a new, and we need to create parallel streams of experience when we are both experiencing it and when we are part of the creative process. Both ways, we need to.
There's a question up front and a lady. I'll offer the privilege to the lady first, and then we'll come back here.
You spoke about democracy in the arts. Can you speak a little bit more about that? I was just interested.
So, I mean, every notion that we expect in a democratic space, we celebrate in this country, do they exist in the way we create art? Do they exist in the way we perform the art form, even very simple things, in the way we relate with the collaborators in the art form? Is the art form itself celebrating the notion of equality, for example, what we present? Does it, in a way, it's a continuation of what he said in some sense, is that does it in a way counteract with what we celebrate beyond that sphere of performance? Are we putting up a mask when we are performing in some fashion, forgetting all that we believe that we want to cherish beyond that point of the stage or the creation of the art? But we don't seem to challenge that when we are part of that space. So how do we change that discourse? How do we change the way we relate to mythology, change the way we relate to reality? How do we, because I think it's a very essential point, because I think a lot of whatever art we create is very undemocratic in many ways. So, I mean, how are we going to create both the experience of democracy in the art making itself, but also I think it does transfer to the people listening, to the people experiencing, because they do see how art is being created. They do see how people are participating. Now, we have to bring those, and also, let's not forget between art forms. You know, we talk about jugalbandis. I mean, that's rubbish. Utter rubbish. Okay, there's nothing, I know, also, it's a very delicate point I just want to raise. You know, for example, especially when you have, say, collaborations between artists and art forms that occupy, say, two different positions in social hierarchy. What happens? Is it truly an equal space of presentation? I mean, I do it, and I know how messy it is, and I try to stay alive to it, but it is not. So then are we then just using ourselves to portray ourselves and just using a set of people or a set of art form to show our inclusivity, to show our sense of diversity? Love these words, don't we? So these are also important conversations, not within the art form only, between art forms. How do we create equity? How do we create a way by which because it's not just the art, right? It's the cultures, because we are a country of so many cultures. I think also in gender, you know, when we have men dominating the stage with women, I mean, what is happening there? All these need to be active conversations between all of us artists in the field, not a question of one person delivering it as some kind of a messiah for the others. Are we even in a position to have that healthy conversation in our world of arts? Very questionable.
I think we have time for one more. There was a question right up front. Yeah.
You know, I'm fascinated by the way you have taken your art and then explored so many more dimensions. To what extent do you feel that you would have to continue to be an artist?
Sorry, to what extent?
Would you have to continue to be an artist and keep developing more about the way you think and believe in the world?
Well, tags are always given to you. You don't ask for them, right? I'd like to just call myself a singer. That's where I come from. If I couldn't sing those 4 lines, I wouldn't be having this conversation today. That's the truth. The day the song stops in me, I've lost everything. Okay? So if I'm having this conversation, right, wrong, that's immaterial, that we can have this conversation, is because beyond all this, art has offered me a window. It's offered me something to say, I can be a better person. Even if it's momentary, even if it's that flash that happens and you feel, I was slightly better for those 10 seconds. But it's us, I mean, that's the only reason I think, in retrospect, I started asking those questions, because those were precious moments. But I also found that I would rather celebrate those moments and then run back to all what I am, which is my control, which is my power, which is my need for so many things. Not that they're wrong, but so I guess I'm at some level very selfishly seeking to hold on to those precious moments. That's all I'm doing.
TM, thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thanks, Sadam.
That was a privilege.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Such a pleasure. Thank you. Thanks.